Tassa namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So as mentioned, this is the Āsīvisopama Sutta, Simile the Vipers, relatively well-known sutta, despite being short and buried in the depths of the Samyutta Nikaya. This is commonly referred to discourse. In fact, I believe I've given talks about it in the past. And again, it's one which is commonly referred to because it does have these colorful metaphors talking about the human experience. So I'll start reading through the discourse. So I'm reading here from Bhante Suddhāso's translation, and I might modify the translation a bit as we go along. So you're welcome to follow along if you wish. So the sutta begins. This is presumably the Buddha speaking. The Buddha says, "Mendicants," it's bhikkhus, bhikkhunis. "Mendicants, suppose there were 4 lethal poisonous vipers. Then a person would come along who wants to live and doesn't want to die, who wants to be happy and recoils from pain." So in Sukhakamo, he translates here as wants to be happy, but it can also mean one who wants pleasure. So one who wants pleasure and avoids pain, is how I would render this. Which is pretty much everyone. Pretty much everyone wants to live and doesn't want to die. They want pleasure and they don't want pain. That's pretty much everyone. So a person comes along who wants to live and doesn't want to die, who wants pleasure and recoils from pain. And they would say to him, "Mister, here are 4 lethal poisonous vipers. They must be periodically picked up, washed, fed, and put to sleep. But when one or another of these 4 poisonous vipers gets angry with you, you will meet with death or deadly pain. So then, mister, do what has to be done." Then that man, terrified of those 4 poisonous vipers, would flee this way or that. They would say to him, "Mister, there are 5 deadly enemies chasing you," thinking, "When we catch sight of him, we will murder him right there. So then, mister, do what has to be done." Then that man, terrified of those 4 poisonous vipers and those 5 deadly enemies, would flee this way or that. They would say to him, "Mister, there is a 6th hidden killer chasing you with a drawn sword, thinking, when I catch sight of him, I'll chop off his head right there. So then, mister, do what has to be done." This guy's having a really bad day. I'm actually feeling really bad for this poor guy. Anyway, the sutta carries on. Then that man, terrified of those 4 poisonous vipers and those 5 deadly enemies and the hidden killer, would flee this way or that. Then he would see an empty village. But whatever house he enters is vacant, deserted, and empty. And whatever vessel he touches is vacant, hollow, and empty. Then they would say to him, "Mister, there are bandits who raid villages, and they're striking now. So then, mister, do what has to be done." Then that man, terrified of those 4 poisonous vipers and those 5 deadly enemies and the hidden killer and the bandits, would flee this way or that. Then he would see a large deluge, a large flood, whose near shore is dubious and perilous, while the far shore is a sanctuary free of peril. But there is no ferry boat or bridge for crossing over. Then that man thought, "Why don't I gather grass, sticks, branches, and leaves and make a raft? Riding on the raft and paddling with my hands and feet, I can safely reach the far shore." And so that man did exactly that. And having crossed over and gone beyond, the Brahman stands on the far shore. So that's the simile. And so next the Buddha explains the meaning. So the Buddha says, "I've made up this simile to make a point, and this is a point." So he says, 4 lethal poisonous vipers is a term for the 4 great elements. So 4 great elements, Bhante Suddhāso translated here as the 4 principal states, which I have a very difficult time accepting that translation. So the elements of earth, water, fire, and air. So Patavi Dhatu, earth element, Apo Dhatu, water element or moisture element, Tejo Dhatu. Tejo literally means heat. It's commonly translated as fire, but it actually literally means heat. So the heat element. And Vayo Dhatu. Vayo actually technically means wind. It's usually translated as air element, but Vayo actually means wind, the wind element. So the four elements here, earth, moisture, heat, and wind, is referring to four ways that we relate to physical experience. So this doesn't necessarily mean that your body is actually literally made up of little bundles of earth, water, heat, and air. But rather it's talking about the subjective experience that we have of physicality. So our subjective experience is the experience of solidity, hardness, heaviness, which is the earth-like aspect of our experience. It's the experience of moisture, of wetness, of fluidity, so the water-like aspect of our experience. The experience of heat and coolness, of temperature, which is the heat aspect of our experience, the fire-like aspect. And the experience of distension and motion, which is the wind-like aspect of our experience, the air element of our experience. So this is one of the ways that the Buddha gives us to start to analyze our experience of reality. And actually the Buddha, elsewhere, he gives two more elements, which are space, the space element, and the consciousness element. And with the addition of those two, then we have a complete picture of body and mind. So the four solid physical elements, then the space element, which is the space occupied by the physical body, the experience of spaciousness, and then the consciousness element, which is the domain of the mind, the field of mind. So then we have a complete picture of the human experience. In this discourse, the Buddha only lists the first four, as is the case in many discourses. So it's referring specifically to understanding our body, understanding how we relate to and experience our body. And of course the nature of the body is that every now and then it goes deranged. So there's another discourse where the Buddha says, from time to time the earth element becomes disturbed. And from time to time the water element becomes disturbed, and so on. And this is something visible in the outside world, but it's also visible in our own body. You can notice how from time to time our body malfunctions, and it becomes, say, feverish. The body becomes feverish, so the heat, the fire element is disturbed. Or you have a lot of gas in your body, so the air element is disturbed. Or maybe you have a lot of mucus buildup or phlegm or gastric fluid or something, so the water element is disturbed. So this is one of the ways of understanding physical ailments, is in terms of disturbances in the four elements. And of course, when the four elements become seriously disturbed, then that can result in deadly illness or death. So when he talks about how at any time one of the vipers might get angry and strike you, bite you, possibly even kill you. It's talking about how our body is unreliable. We seek pleasure and avoid pain. As he said earlier, most people want to live and not die. They want to seek pleasure and not pain. But the nature of our body, composed of the four elements, is that every now and then something goes wrong or gets imbalanced or disturbed, and our body starts producing painful sensations, can start producing actually incredibly disturbing and uncomfortable experiences for us. And at some point this body is going to die, which for most people, death is a remarkably disturbing experience. It's usually not what they want at all. So we have to take care of our body. So as the Buddha spoke about taking care of the four vipers, you need to pet them and cuddle them and feed them and all of that. Well, in the same way, we need to take care of this body, but we also know that eventually it's going to bite us, so to speak. We take care of this body even though we know it's a source of pain and misery, and ultimately will experience death. So coming to full acceptance of the reality of the body is the only way to overcome this problem. If we expect the body to be a source exclusively of pleasure, then of course we're going to be having a really hard time. But when we come to complete terms with the reality of decay, sickness, and death of the body, then those things won't bother us anymore. So it doesn't mean you don't get bit by the viper, to extend the metaphor, but it means that you recognize that that's a natural occurrence and not something to be upset about. Then the next one, the Buddha says, 5 deadly enemies is a term for the 5 khandas affected by grasping. That is, the body, feeling, identification, mental activities, and consciousness. So this next section is talking about the 5 khandas. So khanda is a Pali word which is very difficult to translate directly into English. But the 5 khandas are referring to the 5 components of personal experience, the 5 components of body and mind. And one of the more commonly used translations for the word khanda is aggregate, which, unless you're working in masonry, most people have never encountered the word aggregate prior to Buddhism, because its sole use is in the domain of masonry. So aggregate literally means a collection of disparate components. So different components mixed together, which isn't particularly useful. So saying 5 aggregates doesn't really mean anything. You might as well just say 5 khandas. It's an equally useless word, and requires just as much explanation. So what are the khandas? What are the 5 khandas? The 5 khandas are the 5 components of body and mind. So 4 aspects of mind, and the 5th aspect is the body. And the Buddha further clarifies in many places in the suttas, he clarifies that the source of suffering is when the 5 khandas are affected by grasping, are affected by the mind which is constantly trying to acquire and hold on to things. So the 5 components of body-mind are just part of nature. There's not actually anything fundamentally wrong with the existence of a body and a mind. The problem is that we latch onto it with desire and aversion. We latch onto it with self-identity. So we think this body is me, this body is mine, this mind is me, this mind is mine, this is who I am, this belongs to me. And we try to hold on to it in one condition, or we desire for it to be in another condition. And that desire and attachment and identity in relationship to the 5 khandas then makes it what's called the 5 khandas affected by grasping, the upadana khanda. And that is what causes suffering, is when there's grasping and self-identity related to the 5 components of body and mind. And so the 5 components are, first, Rupa. So Rupa is the physical body. Vedana. Vedana is commonly translated as feeling. And specifically, Vedana refers to the experience of pleasure, pain, and neutral sensation. So whenever we have a sensation, we relate to it as either pleasant, painful, or neutral. This is what's called Vedana. Then Sanya. Sanya refers to identification or recognition. Can also mean memory. It's commonly translated as perception. But specifically, Sanya is the mental process of identifying an experience. So we have some sensory experience, and then we decide what we think it is. And deciding what we think it is Sanya. So for example, you see something. Well, at first it's just a bundle of abstract visual information. But then the mind is like, oh, I know what that is. That's a yellow meditation cushion. Or that's a glass of water. So deciding it's a yellow meditation cushion or a glass of water is sanya. And sanya is often distorted or even flat out incorrect. We're often misidentifying our sensory experiences, identifying things incorrectly or in a distorted and inaccurate way. Then the fourth kanda is sankara. So sankara is another complex Pali word which is difficult to translate directly and simply. And actually the word sankara can mean several different things depending on context. In the context of the five kandas, it's talking about mental activities. Mental formations is one of the older translations. But it tends to have a more active sense, so mental activities, what one is doing with the mind. But this also includes subconscious mental activities. So not just things which we're clearly consciously aware of, but also the subconscious movements of mind, subconscious tendencies of mind. And finally, consciousness, vijnana, which normally is understood to refer to awareness of our sensory domains. Awareness of the 6 sensory domains, which we'll get to in just a moment. And then the Buddha says, the 6th hidden killer with a drawn sword is a term for relishing and greed. So nandi raga, which means delight and lust. So this is kind of the added danger. So we have the 5 kandas, which are our deadly enemies, but then there's a 6th one, which is even worse, and that's delight and lust. So when we become infatuated with something, obsessed with something, enamored with something, then that's that extra layer of danger added onto the 5 components of body and mind. So the 5 components of body and mind, when affected by grasping, are already deadly enemies, as the Buddha says. But then when we add in delight and lust, then we're adding yet another killer to the mix. So something that's even more dangerous than the 5 components of body and mind. So, and then in the metaphor, the person runs to a village, presumably hoping to find safety in the village. And the Buddha said that everything in the village is empty. All the houses are empty, all the vessels are empty. So the Buddha says, empty village is a term for the 6 interior sense fields. So the 6 interior sense fields means eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So the 6 ways that we receive sensory information. So we receive visual information with our eyes, auditory information with our ears, olfactory information with our nose, and so on. And the Buddha says, if an astute, competent, clever person investigates this in relation to the eye, it appears vacant, hollow, and empty. So the point here is that there's no self to be found. This is why it's said to be empty. So you go to a house thinking that somebody lives in the house, but when you look in the house, there's nobody there. So the Buddha says it's the same way with our body and mind. We look at a body-mind and we expect that there's a person living inside. We expect to find a soul living inside the body. But when you look there, there's actually no one to be found. There's a natural process of cause and effect, manifesting according to the laws of causality. But there's no person to be found. So here the Buddha is talking about anatta, the teaching of non-self, of emptiness. That when you look at the 6 senses, so you think, oh, there's a person who is seeing, there's a person who is hearing. But when you look, there's no person, there's only seeing. There's no person, there's only hearing. So there's not a person who hears, there is just hearing. So it's a natural process. When eye meets sights in the presence of consciousness, then there is the experience of seeing. It's a natural process. But there's no person to be found. There's no ongoing existent entity to be found. There's just a natural process which results in an experience of sensation. So he says that for each of the the 6 sense domains: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And then he says, bandits who raid villages is a term for the 6 exterior sense fields. So the exterior sense field is sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. So the 6 external sensory objects, which then contact the 6 sense fields to generate the experience of sensation. So a visual object needs to come in contact with the eye in order for there to be seeing. A sound needs to come in contact with the ear in order for there to be hearing, and so on. So the Buddha says, the eye is struck by both agreeable and disagreeable sights. The ear is struck by both agreeable and disagreeable sounds, and so on. So this is where he's talking about the village that gets attacked by bandits. So he's saying how our 6 sensory fields are being attacked by sensations. A similar metaphor that he gives elsewhere is the metaphor of the flayed cow. So a cow whose skin has been peeled off and then it's being constantly attacked by insects all the time. Well, the Buddha gave that as a metaphor for sensation. He said we're being constantly attacked by sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought, in the same way that a flayed cow is being constantly attacked by predatory insects. So he is emphasizing the painful nature of sensation. It's like being constantly harassed. Again, for someone who's addicted to sensual pleasure, this is not something that's easy to understand, because we relate to sensation as an avenue for pleasant experiences. But as the Buddha says here, he says, but we have both pleasant and unpleasant experiences, both enjoyable and painful experiences. And this is just the nature of sensation, that it will be constantly producing sensations which are sometimes pleasant and sometimes painful. So in this sense, we're constantly being attacked by sensations which can disturb our mind. So the point of all of this is that safety cannot be found in the body, safety cannot be found in the mind, safety cannot be found in our sensations. And we cannot experience exclusively pleasant, desirable experiences, but we'll always be experiencing a mixture of pleasure and pain, a mixture of enjoyable and disagreeable things. So the point here is emphasizing that as long as we inhabit and identify with our body and mind, then we're constantly putting ourselves in the face of danger. So the 4 lethal vipers, so you're constantly handling poisonous vipers, so you're constantly at risk of getting bitten. The 5 deadly enemies, well, the enemies might attack you at any time. The 6th hidden killer, ready to cut your head off. The empty village, so it's empty, there's no friends there. And it's constantly getting attacked by bandits. So he's talking about how this experience of being an unenlightened person, identifying as a body and mind, is putting us constantly in risk of suffering, constantly in the way of suffering. So then the Buddha carries on, he says, large deluge is a term for the 4 floods. The flood of sensuality, the flood of existence, the flood of views, and the flood of ignorance. So the 4 floods is one way that the Buddha talks about the overwhelming defilements of the mind. So these 4 ways that we become overwhelmed by the world. And it's related to the word asava. So asava has a similar meaning, a meaning of flow of corruption. And it's the same list, actually. So sensuality, existence, opinions, and ignorance. So the mind is being flooded and overwhelmed and corrupted by sensuality. We become fixated on sensuality, and so the mind becomes flooded with sensual thoughts, flooded with sensual cravings, flooded with sensual perceptions and ideas. And then that keeps us mired in body and mind, stuck in this undesirable situation where we're constantly being targeted by painful and unpleasant experiences. And the flood of existence, of bhava, of being, wanting to be something, wanting to become something, wanting to exist in a particular way. So this is closely related to self-identity. It's like, well, I want to be such and such. Doesn't actually matter what it is you want to be. Wanting to be is directly arising from self-centeredness, self-absorption, self-fixation. I want to be. So it's this fixation on self-identity, this self-centered approach to reality. And as long as we're self-centered, then we're posing a target for the bandits, the enemies, the killer, the snakes. We're giving them something to attack. The flood of opinions and views. So as long as we have fixed viewpoints and opinions about reality, then that means we're always out of touch with the way things actually are. So this is one of the ongoing themes of the Buddha's teachings, which is to set aside our viewpoints and opinions and beliefs and instead see reality as it actually is, which is only possible when we set aside our pre-existing concepts. Then we can open our mind to seeing things as they actually are. And finally, the flood of ignorance. So ignorance is when, once again, we're not seeing things clearly. We're not perceiving things accurately. So this can arise from attachment to pre-existing opinions, or it can just arise from actually not wanting to know. Some people actually prefer living in their comfortable fantasies rather than facing reality on its own terms. But true happiness and wisdom only comes through facing reality as it is. If we try to escape from it, we just mire ourselves further into suffering and confusion. So then the Buddha continues, he says, the near shore that's dubious and perilous is a term for Sakaya. And it becomes necessary to explain the word Sakaya. So Sakaya we usually encounter in the term Sakaya Ditti, which is one of the 3 obstacles to the first stage of awakening. And the Buddha defines Sakaya Ditti as identifying as body and mind. So thinking this body is me, this body is mine, this body is who I am. Or thinking this mind or any component of this mind is me, is mine, is who I am. So that's Sakaya Ditti. So Sakaya is self-identity. It's translated here as substantial reality, which is an interesting translation, and Bhante Suddhāso wrote a long article explaining why he translated it that way. And I really want to like that translation, but I just can't get on board with it. Sakaya means self-identity. It's clearly defined as such in the suttas. So this is what makes the near shore so dangerous. So in the metaphor the Buddha is giving here, so why is it that the vipers and the bandits and the village and all of that, why is all of that dangerous? It's dangerous because of self-identity. It's dangerous because we're giving a target for all of these hostile forces. So what makes samsara a dangerous place is not samsara itself, because samsara is just nature. What makes samsara a dangerous place is the fact that we're putting up a target for everything to attack. And that target is our self-identity, which in Pali is called Sakaya in many places. And he says, the far shore, a sanctuary free of peril, is a term for Nibana. So Nibana is, of course, the final goal of the Buddhist path. Nibana is complete awakening, complete enlightenment, the complete extinguishment of greed, hatred, and delusion. So this is why the word Nibana is sometimes translated as extinguishment. It's because it's the extinguishment of greed, hatred, and delusion. It's the complete purification of the mind by removing all of its defilements and delusions. And so this is the only true safety. So we cannot find safety in our bodies. We cannot find safety in our sensations. We cannot find safety in our thoughts. We cannot find safety in our self-identity. In all those places we will only find danger, which is the point of the metaphors the Buddha is giving here. Safety can only be found in the extinguishment of greed, hatred, and delusion, which is the attainment of full awakening, and the relinquishment of self-centeredness. And so then the Buddha says the raft, so he gave the simile of the raft crossing the river. And this is not the famous discourse on the simile of the raft. There's another discourse where the Buddha gives a more detailed description of the simile of the raft. So this is just a brief reference to the simile of the raft. He doesn't go into detail here. So he says, the raft is a term for the Noble Eightfold Path. That is, right view, right attitude, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So once again, the Noble Eightfold Path, Samma Ditti, Samma Sankappa, Samma Vacha, Samma Kammanto, Samma Ajivo, Samma Vayamo, Samma Sati, and Samma Samadhi. So the 8 necessary components of Buddhist practice. And he carries on, he says, paddling with hands and feet is a term for rousing energy. So in other words, we actually need to put effort into following the Eightfold Path. It doesn't just happen by itself. It's not enough just to identify as Buddhist. It's not enough just to read books about Buddhism. It's not enough just to go to the temple once in a while. But we actually need to make a sincere effort to live and embody the Noble Eightfold Path completely. And finally, the Buddha says, crossed over, gone beyond, the Brahman stands on the far shore, is a term for an arhat. So arhat is a fully awakened being, a fully perfected and worthy one who's fully awakened. So crossed over, and that they've crossed over the flood. They've crossed over the flood of defilements. Gone beyond, so they've transcended all the dangers and problems of samsara, of unawakened existence. And standing on the shore, so it's again the sense that one is firmly, solidly established. One is unshakably established in awakening. So once one attains full awakening, there's no coming back from that. You cannot backslide into delusion again. This is why it's considered a place of perfect safety. Once the mind is fully purified and awake, then it will never lose that purity and wisdom. And here he's referring to an arhat as a Brahman. So in the suttas, the term Brahman is often used to mean any holy person, any sage, any saint. So anyone who has practiced spiritual practice to such a degree that their mind becomes highly purified. So in the suttas, the word Brahman doesn't refer only to a member of the Hindu caste system, but rather it also is used to mean more generally a highly advanced spiritual practitioner, a highly advanced sage who's purified their heart and mind to a very high degree. And in many places, the Buddha uses the word Brahman as synonymous to arhat, a fully awakened one. So that's the end of the sutta. So we can respect the sutta at this time with 3 sadhus, and then I'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So hello to the people joining in online. Hello to Maria, Rebecca, Madeline, Manal, Karuna, Bhumika, Madeline, Christina, Jody, Jayanta. There's a name here in Burmese, but I don't read Burmese letters, I'm sorry. Yankee, Marielle, Sud, Andre, Hui. There's a name in Thai. Ian, Olga, Usha, Gregory, Ryan, and Mimi. Welcome to all of you. However, I don't see any questions. So before we conclude for the day, just like to remind all of you that you're welcome to request suttas. So as mentioned, the sutta today was a specific request from one of our viewers. So feel free to email sutta requests to the monastery, and there's a chance that it will be spoken about in an upcoming session. So for now, we'll conclude the session with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you later today for a monk chat.